afternoon, and welcome to episode 11 of International Expansion Explained. My guest today is Kimberly Kirkendall, who began her career on the ground in China over 35 years ago after also studying in China. Then, having lived in Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, France, Germany, and quite a lot of places around the US. She combines her technical expertise and experience in manufacturing, operations, sales, and also working as a CPA with her deep knowledge of how business really operates internationally. She's currently the president of International Resource Development, which is a company focused on international trade consultancy. She's also a beachhead advisor for New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, and a new project, hosts a podcast on international trade. She's also teaching, because doing all of that isn't enough, teaching a series of courses for women in operations, lecturing for various universities, and also being a guest speaker. Kim, thank you for joining me today. It is a real pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Kathryn. Always a pleasure to see you and talk with you. So thank you very much for inviting me.
So maybe we can start out. Hi, I can see there's a couple of people. Alberto Antinucci
Hey,
and
Alberto.
Stefan Huey. So thanks, guys, for the confirmation that LinkedIn, we're connected, we're live on LinkedIn. It's always good to have that reassurance. Um, Maybe you can start out by explaining a little bit, how did you actually get into international business and what attracted you? I mean, studying in China is not something that everybody's done. How did you basically come to those choices, and how did you arrive at where you are today?
Thank you, Kathryn. Yeah, it's funny. I always blame it on reading. I was a big reader of books when I was a child, and I really wanted to live overseas. Yeah, yeah, I love your background. I really wanted to live overseas and live that kind of lifestyle. That I grew up in a very small village that in the middle of the United States, and my family had been there for 7 generations. And so really deep roots. And I really wanted to fly out and live around the world and live that kind of a life. So that's what propelled me to study international business at university. And I had been studying Spanish, was fluent in Spanish, but this was during the recession in the mid 80s. And I thought, this is not enough for me to get a job. So I need to pivot and take a more complicated language. And I felt comfortable with the Chinese culture in the sense that it's very similar to small town village culture, where families are important, your community is important, your relationships are important. So I pivoted to Chinese, and then that university had a program which was very unusual in the mid 80s, where they would send 2 students to study at university in China, and then 2 professors from that university came to the US to learn how to teach English better. So it was an exchange. So other than Fulbright, there weren't many opportunities to go live and study in China at that time because you couldn't do it independently. You had to be part of a program. So that's how I got into China in the beginning. And then I was looking for a way to start my career over there because I wanted to start working overseas immediately out of college, because I was concerned if I waited, went to a big corporation, hoped that they might send me overseas someday. Many people never get that opportunity then. They end up in the corporate wheel and they never
Yeah.
get a chance to go. So I ended up, long story short, finding a company that was launching 2 factories outside in a very small village far outside of Shanghai, with owned by the Chinese government, because that was the only way to do it at the time. So they hired me to go oversee the factories. And funny story, after about 6 months, I said to the owner of the business, why me? I'm 22 years old. I've never set foot in a factory in my life. I've lived in China. I studied business, but seriously, why me? I mean, I knew they liked me, so I thought it was safe to ask the question. And told me that the person who built the factories, the American they had sent over before me, had 30 years manufacturing experience, but didn't understand China. And they realized they could teach me manufacturing faster than they could teach someone like him how to understand living in the culture.
Yeah.
Especially with the language. So, and I think that's very true for international trade of any kind. It's great to have your technical skills and capabilities, but if you can't adopt and adapt to the culture and not just the culture in how you communicate politely, but the culture of how business is done and what the
Yes.
value systems are around whether profit's more important than keeping people employed, or what management styles are like. I mean, that's very important. So that was how I started my career. For the same company, I ran the Asia Pacific headquarters in Hong Kong after the factories in Shanghai for 2 years. Came back to the US, ended up on the West Coast managing all the Asian sourcing for a different company. Did that for a few years, came back to the middle where I had grown up, stayed in operations, became a CPA. I was looking for something to round out my skill set, and I had supply chain operations. I handled international sales when I was in Hong Kong, but I really felt learning the financial accounting side of the business would help me. So I studied and became a CPA, worked for a regional CPA firm, was CFO for a group of companies, and started my own consultancy. So I've worked with a lot of major companies, a lot of industrial companies, some product companies that, we're not going to share this, right? So Disney, Vitamix, American Greetings, Gojo Purell, like a variety of consumer products companies. And so I worked with them over the years. And so that's kind of how I got to where I am now.
Very cool. It's always fascinating to hear people's international stories because there are some core elements, especially these elements of understanding the culture of doing business, that are just, everybody talks about the culture of doing business because everybody who's working internationally has made that experience. Um, and it's always interesting to know how people actually reached that particular point. So, I mean, whilst we were doing our pre-discussions for today, we kind of determined on this topic that we would talk about what happens after you've made the first international sale, because I think it's often a little bit of a neglected topic. And for the international expansion explained, then what I want to do is to help companies make systematic and sustainable exports rather than just one-off spot business. So what do you see as the main aspects that companies need to start thinking about once they've made that first sale abroad? They've probably, hopefully, they've got the money in the bank. And as far as they're concerned, now they're exporters and they've made it. They're now an international company. But actually, if they want to keep on doing business with those clients, then that is just the first step. So where would you suggest are the next steps that they need to be thinking about? Of course, ideally before they reach that particular point in time, but what would you suggest would be the next most important things that they need to think about once that first order is
Yeah,
complete?
I think what a lot of times companies don't consider is once I've shipped my product overseas, there's a possibility that that customer, whether it's your distributor, or you're shipping directly to end customers, they're going to have questions. They may not know how to use your product. They may misuse it. There may be some kind of damage. They may need to get it repaired. It may integrate with some other product and maybe they have trouble integrating it. So how are you going to support them? I think is the big issue. And around that is what are your policies? What are your agreements? What have you promised? What kind of support have you promised to give them? So there's a lot of things that wrap around that. And, so for example, you're selling, let's not pick something electronic, but you're selling even something like a specialty cream or lotion, and you're selling that overseas, and customers start to say to you, does it react differently with different kinds of water? Because it's not helping my skin. Is it the water in my country? Or, it's given me a rash, what kind of chemicals are in it? Or is there some natural homeopathic? So these are all questions and support that people might ask you, and you need to be prepared to give that. So I think that's, the biggest issue, and the type of, you need to use that as the driver to think through. Now, when those types of situations happen, how can I prepare today to handle those properly?
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the easiest kind of scenarios is the one with you've sold some piece of equipment, be it a car or be it some piece of agricultural equipment, and you've got all of those questions of, do you have all of the spare parts available? Do you have all of those kind of things? And you've also got to ask yourself that question, and of course, it should be a bit earlier in the process. Um, do people use this product in the same way in the country that I'm selling it to as they would do in our home country? Maybe our FAQs need to be a bit different to what we originally had. So, yeah, I
Yeah, I
mean,
think it's very can be very complex. If you're selling something industrial,
yes,
then absolutely, you need to have instructions, you need to have safety information. How is the customer going to repair that product? Can they get spare parts? Will you have a partner in country who can handle the repairs, who can stock the spare parts? Will you hire a outside service company? Will you hire your own person to manage that? If it's consumer products, it's less, there still may be some repair and replacement part issues, but they're typically not as frequent as it would be with an industrial product. But to your point, before you even sell anything overseas, hopefully you've understood how are people in that country going to use my product. I mean, that's a go no go decision in a lot of
yeah,
ways.
yeah,
Will they even utilize it? Do I even want to sell it? Does it make sense?
yeah.
So that's definitely a precursor to making sales.
Do you find that companies start to think about these kind of after sales steps? If I say when it's too late, I'm
After
actually
the
meaning
sale?
after the sale, they get the product at least halfway across the ocean, and they suddenly realize that maybe there are also some other questions that might be coming up, and that they also should be thinking about in order to really offer a great experience in that country and to really build their brand properly.
Or they don't realize it until they get the first question.
Yeah,
They get the first question and I mean, I have, client in medical devices that is selling their products in Europe and in Canada from the US. And I said, do you have, certification there? And he's like, what do we need? You just want to go, excuse, hello, hello.
a bit of
Um,
a bit of safety certification is
Might be a good plan. So yeah, I think it can be very easy for companies. I find are fearful to sell their products overseas, and then once they make those first sale, they go from being overly fearful to not fearful enough, and maybe fearful isn't the right word, but they're so concerned. Am I going to have a market? Can I sell it? Will I get paid? Will my product be copied? Will my product be misused? Like all these fears before the sale. And they're not thinking about, after the sale, what's
yeah,
going to happen if the customer has a failure or has a question or has a problem. And so those other early fears tend to take over their attention, and they're not thinking about some of the follow-up, customer service, customer, response to the customer support. They're
yeah.
not thinking about those things until after the sale is made and the money's in the bank. And now suddenly the customer contacts them and they think, wow, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. No, I think that at first, especially in the beginning, there tends to be a lot of focus on these kind of building blocks of all of the logistics and how do I make sure I get the product from A to B and how do I make sure that I get paid? And they're not thinking so much about the big picture as to how I'm actually going to develop this market in the long term. What do I need to put in place to actually make sure that my partners locally, probably, I mean, if it's be it the end, if I say the end user or the end purchaser, be if it's an industrial product, if and I'm delivering directly on a project, or perhaps it's a distributor. I've also got to equip my distributor in order to actually do good business with those products, don't I? I mean,
We just actually reviewed a distribution agreement for a company that in the United States. This is one of the New Zealand companies that I work with. And, in that distribution agreement with their distributor, there are all the terms. And you and I talked about distributor agreements recently.
yeah.
But what I want people to think about these distributor agreements, they're not just Americans, especially tend to think about these things as litigation avoidance. What can I put in the agreement to avoid going to court later or to succeed if I have to go to court later? And I encourage you to think about these agreements as a roadmap for how we're going to do business, right? Not just a roadmap for how we're going to litigate this if we ever get into an argument. So in this agreement, there's the legal part of it. When does ownership transfer? When are payments made? What can the distributor provide to the customer on this product? But attached to it is just what I ended up renaming. They had it as terms and conditions. I said, let's make it a distributor manual. And the distributor manual also is part of the contract and has to be signed. But the distributor manual says, we expect you to share information with us about the customers. We have a warranty between us as the manufacturer and the customer directly. You cannot make promises outside of that warranty. If there are repairs, they have to come to us. They don't come to you. If they come to you, they invalidate the warranty. So they took their original warranty and the terms and conditions that they use when they on their purchase orders that talk about the sale, and we put all that kind of together in this distributor manual to make sure that it was clear to the distributor, what's expected of them, what's expected of the manufacturer. And then also I ended up changing the warranty a little bit because this company had sold somewhat internationally, but not quite so far away as they were launching in the US and then eventually in Europe. And their warranty didn't specifically call out that if the product was purchased through a distributor, the distributor could not provide service, could not provide additional promises on top of what was in the warranty itself. So, those are things that are important. So selling overseas, having a warranty that's specific to an overseas client, your domestic warranty may not work. Having a distributor agreement that's specific to that international client and that distributor in that market, modifying your terms and conditions of the order to reflect what's going to be the case with that distributor agreement. Those are all, really important steps to take.
Yeah, and I think you've got to strike that balance between there's a different legal framework for the country that you're going into, and there's also that question of what is the usual expectation. There might be a legal requirement for me to give some kind of warranty, but there might be the expectation that usually on this kind of product, I get a different level of service. And if you're not aware of what that level of service is in a different market, then you can really end up disappointing your clients very fast if you're not
That's an
going to.
excellent point. And you see that when you're exporting into China frequently, is that warranty or no warranty, the Chinese expectation is you're going to stand behind your product because it's your reputation, and reputation is very important. So if you have a disclaimer in your warranty, they oftentimes their attitude is, so what? It's your product. We paid $50,000 for it. It's a lot of money. How can you not come fix it just because you have this disclaimer that says you don't have to fix it?
Yeah.
Our other suppliers that we would buy equipment from, they would fix it. Why aren't you fixing it?
Yeah.
So it's definitely true that no matter what you have in writing in your documents, if that contradicts what's normal in that business environment, then you're going to have some kind of a problem.
And so do you recommend that companies work together with a consultant, or that they discuss very closely with their distribution partners about what level of service is going to be expected? Because I think if you go to a distributor and say to them, okay, what level of after sales, how does after sales service on, I don't know, this kind of product look like, then they are going to tell you what for them would be their wished for solution. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the one that's usual in the market, does it? So how
No,
can
and
people
sometimes
really?
too, in certain cultures, they may not want to contradict you, or they may
Yes.
assume that you already know something, and so they don't include it. So sending over your warranties and your agreements first, asking for feedback on those to see, is there, and then talking to some key customers to find out. And again, I laughed about consultants because we're both consultants, but talking to a consultant about what's normal in this environment, what can I expect in this country environment? What's the norm for after sales service or refunds? Who pays for the raw the parts, the spare parts, who pays for those, who
Mm.
comes and provides the fixing? Are we expected to teach them how to do that?
Yeah.
So those are all things that you really need to understand.
And you've also, I mean, on the other side, I used to have the situation with infant formula to China, with especially with cross border. You've got the situation that you would sell a product cross border into the market, but if the package was damaged in some way, the mother would return it and expect it to be replaced. But because it was a cross-border product, you couldn't actually bring it back out into you couldn't actually bring it back out into your stock. So you had to also work out what to do with these returned products and how to use them. Maybe you can use them for marketing, maybe you can use them for some kind of activities, but you had to also start to think about how to deal with those products. Or, I mean, if you sell products into Europe, like, for example, fridges, a refrigerator has to, in Austria and Germany, the manufacturer, at least in Austria, the manufacturer has to, they have to pay a certain, included in the price is a certain fee for recycling that afterwards. So you have to also have those kind of local norms about how to dispose of the product, what happens with it? Is it ecological? Are you, yeah, fulfilling all of those kind of norms?
And we don't want to scare everyone away with the complexities, but as we were talking, I was reminded of a client a number of years ago that was selling fundamentally a software product for industrial equipment, and it could be installed in the equipment, and it would give the customer better information about why that the parts were maybe coming off the line with defects. So if you installed this software, it would analyze the way the equipment was running and give you better data. The problem, which sounds fabulous, right? And it would be a great product in China or India or countries with heavy manufacturing and this type of equipment. But the problem was that to utilize it, the person running the machine had to make a lot of decisions. There was no clear, yes, no metric of, if this information comes out, it absolutely means you turn the lever from 3 to 10.
Mm.
The way that the software worked was, when the information came out, you had to just make decisions about, okay, this number is a little high, this number is a little low. So that means maybe this over here is the first thing that we try, and we try this. And if that doesn't work, and that's a problem in some cultures where it's a very hierarchical structure, and people that are in these operating positions are not comfortable making those kinds of decisions. They want very clear metrics that if this is wrong, if the product's coming off the line wrong, this number tells me what to do and how to fix it. It doesn't give me information that I have to then try and potentially fail and decide how to use. So for the company then, do they create another layer of software that does the analysis and spits out a turn the knob from 3 to 10 answer? Or do they provide a human that analyzes the data and says, okay, to try this and then try that and then try this. What do they do? Because selling it as is in that market is not going to be successful.
Yeah.
So, it's very important. We talk about after sales and we think about warranties and customer service and spare parts, but after sales can also include, how is the customer actually going to utilize the product? And are they going, and you had mentioned earlier, will it fit in that country, in that culture? Will
Yeah.
they be able to, in a culture that's uncomfortable taking risks and making decisions, will they be able to utilize something that spits out information this way?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm a little bit of a process nerd, so I always like to have things
This is why we get
standardized.
along so well.
I like to have things. I like to have the things that you can standardize standardized, and so I'm a big fan of companies training their overseas partners so that they actually, at least on the basics, that they can answer the questions, so that they're not coming with every little question that comes, that they know how to deal with the basics, because it really can drive you crazy if they're coming to you every time they get a small customer inquiry. And on the other hand, I mean, I've had the experience in Asia, be it in Vietnam, be it in Hong Kong, be it in mainland China, of clients not wanting to, a distribution partner maybe not wanting to come to you and tell you that they've got a problem with something, partly because they don't, because as a from a cultural perspective, they don't want to admit that a client asked a question and they can't answer the question, but also because maybe they feel that a European company takes a long time to answer a question and they feel they need to answer the question very, very quickly. And so what sometimes then happens is they come up with their own answer to that question, which may or may not be right.
Yeah, I often tell companies, garbage in, garbage out, right? If you aren't being extremely clear with your distributors or your suppliers or your customers, whoever it is, if you're not being extremely clear about your product, your expectations, your sales cycle, the instructions for using it, how you want it manufactured, whatever it is, you're leaving that other person to make decisions. And they may not make decisions the same way you would make decisions.
Yeah.
So coming back to me and telling me, oh, the factory screwed it up or the distributor didn't do what we wanted them to do, the first thing I'm going to ask is, show me where you told them what to do.
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, either they haven't told them at all, or they haven't told them clearly what was expected. And so then how can you really be upset? Because you haven't set the expectation, you haven't set the standard. And so obviously they weren't obligated to meet it, right? Just because you assumed it, you assumed that's how everyone uses this product or why they value. I had a client years ago that made safety testing equipment in the automotive industry for a particular part. I won't say what, but they found that some of their, a lot of these automotives are being manufactured in these parts in India, Malaysia, China. And so they went to one of their customers who bought this piece of equipment, which was $1 million piece of equipment. They weren't using it. It was sitting on the floor like your grandfather would have bought a really nice Mercedes convertible and then been afraid to drive it. So it was sitting on the factory floor because they wanted to show their customers that they cared about quality, but they didn't want to use it because then it might break down and they'd have to fix it. And they were so sure their quality was good anyways, they didn't think they really needed it. But they needed it not to check the quality, but to show the customer they cared about quality.
Yeah.
So that was what they valued about this equipment, which is so mind-blowing, to other countries or cultures, to say, you bought it, why aren't you using it? So it can be more radically different than you expect. And so if you're not clearly, I'm huge about procedures. The other thing I love about procedures and forms is that you can do all the training you want to do. You can incentivize people to follow, your regulations or to reach a certain outcome. But one of the best drivers of behavior is forms. And I'm sorry, everyone, I know you hate forms. But one of the best drivers of behavior is forms. Because if I have to fill out the form, then I have to go through whatever it's telling me to do. I have to check that I've looked at these numbers,
Yes.
or that when I've opened the box, I've written down the serial number. I have to sign it and take responsibility for it. And that changes how people think about whatever it is they're doing. So when it comes to product instructions or distributor instructions, is there a form that says when you give training to customers, you have to sign this form and there's a checklist? I trained the customer on these things and the customer demonstrated their capability on these things, and I'm signing my name that they understand it. And in many, many cultures, not all, that creates an accountability, a
Yeah.
feeling of accountability. So I don't like useless forms more than anyone else does, but there are times that they're really, really useful.
Yeah. And I think that that kind of thing, so this kind of training in conjunction with a set of SOPs, a standard procedures, and a kind of operator's manual, if you like, that this gives a really solid foundation for an overseas partner to know how best to deal with it. And any questions that are not dealt with within this documentation set, come to us and ask. I
And
think
in some cultures, people are uncomfortable asking
yes,
because
yes,
because if it not because they not only because they look like they failed to understand it if they ask, but also because you then failed to explain it properly if they
yeah,
have to ask. So they're uncomfortable asking. So, it's better. I've had clients over the years who said, why my Asian factory wants me to give them, they don't want to come up with their own employee manual. They want me to give them an employee manual, but then as soon as they got it, they changed it. And I said, well, they wanted it because they wanted to know what you think right is.
yeah,
And once they understand what you think right is, they're more comfortable modifying it for their environment. But for them to take from nothing and present to you what you might like or not like, and then you to change it is harder to do, right?
mm,
So just generally speaking, I challenge my clients, if you had to take this document and hand it to a 12-year-old, and that might be too old, let's say 10, a 10-year-old, and with they couldn't ask you questions, they couldn't Google anything, all they had was the document and the product. Could a 10-year-old operate it or build it or whatever it is? If not, it's not easy enough. You think that it's straightforward, but you're too close to it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, let's face it, all of us have those things where it seems self-explanatory to us because that is what we are dealing with day in, day out. But when you actually try and explain it to somebody else, they're like, "Oh, that is so complex. I don't know how you deal with it." I mean, I think that's everybody has that kind of thing. So, if you had to say what are the top three mistakes, for example, that you see companies making in the after sales process, what would you say that those are?
I think one of the first things is what we've been talking about, which is not having enough documentation, right?
Hmm.
So providing a lot of documentation for your distributors and your customers overseas is important. Secondly, is not doing your research on how your product is going to be used, the environment that it's used in, the challenges that they may face. If you have, a piece of equipment that operates in most countries, but it can't tolerate surges in electricity. And
Hmm.
in that environment, there are surges in electricity.
Yeah.
So you need to do your research to understand not just the market. We think about researching the market, where our customers, how, where's the biggest market for CNC machine equipment or whatever. Not about, once it's on the factory floor, how is it actually going to be used? And is there enough lighting, or what we consider to be enough lighting? And are the operators going to be trained? And are they going to have access to running water, or consistent electricity, or, whatever might be in that environment. And then I think the third thing is planning for worst case scenario outcomes. So having a phone number, an email address, a way for people in that country to contact support, whether it be you or someone else that you put in place. Having those things in place, even if it seems remote to you that somebody could ever have a problem with your product or your equipment in that way, planning for it so that you're not caught unawares because you didn't do step 2 and do your research well enough. And it turns out there's a challenge in using your product in that country. You need a way for those people to contact you, or to send information or get parts or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nightmare for me, the worst case scenario, especially in the past dealing with a lot of food products, is the idea of having some kind of PR crisis. Somebody consumes your product or uses skincare that you've sold, and they have some kind of health reaction of one kind or another, and you have to literally go into crisis mode because the authorities are at the door saying they're going to pull everything off the shelves, or you know those kind of things. And I think you realize when you start exporting that often the procedures that you have for your domestic market are not robust enough, because you suddenly realize that when you actually stretch that procedure halfway around the world, then it doesn't work anymore. And you have to rethink also your domestic processes, because you suddenly realize if that happened at home, it would also be a fire, let's say. Then you have to rethink how you can do those kind of things. I think it's often.
Yeah, it's all a learning curve, right? And as much research as you do, and as many people as you ask, you're always going to be learning and realizing that you need a little bit more information, or you should maybe include an expensive replacement part with the product, or provide additional training, or change your training program to
Mhm.
fit better in that environment, that people aren't comfortable dialing internationally. And so, oddly enough, your average American is not comfortable dialing internationally.
Yeah.
They don't make international calls. They don't understand how to do it. So if they're buying a product from out of the country, from Europe or wherever, and they have to call a number in France, even if it's an English speaking person on the other end, they may not know how to do that.
Yeah.
Or if it's an older population that isn't comfortable with chatting online as a means of getting product resolution, or WhatsApp is not as common in
Mhm.
the United States as it is in the majority of the rest of the world. So you may have a WhatsApp um, customer portal that's robust and works in many countries, but there may be some countries where it's not, and you need Facebook Messenger, you need, WeChat, or whatever other methodology. So it's an ongoing learning curve, and you have to stay agile to react to your customers, and adapt your procedures.
Yeah. And so, other than like customer service and various after sales activities, what happens after a sale that companies don't prepare for, but which they should be preparing for? Is there anything that we've not touched on yet that?
Well, we've kind of talked about warranties, but not a lot. Again, your warranty may work when you're in country, and you can receive the goods back and it won't work when the customer's out of the country, and to your point, it's hard to ship it, ship it in or out or back. So I think warranty is something we haven't spent a lot of time on, but it's, a written warranty, right, that goes with the product that's clear. I think that's really important.
As well as the question of statutory warranty,
Requirements.
which
Yeah.
varies from one market to the next. Even within the EU, it's not always exactly the same.
And I mentioned briefly regulatory, which shouldn't be an aftermarket concern. It should be a before market concern, that you understand what the regulatory requirements are, for your product in that country. And they may be very different, or the product may be classified differently. There may be export controls on your product, which again is should be a pre-shipment concern,
Yes.
not a post-shipment concern. But yeah, I think it's very easy when you're starting exports to think about the sales and how to find a distributor and how to find a customer and how to practically ship your product and how much is it going to cost and what are you going to price it for, and not think about the technical what ifs of if it fails, if it needs returned, if the customer doesn't understand it, and we're talking now about those what ifs. What if something goes wrong, or what if someone needs more help?
And at the end of the day, we're not necessarily talking about something that is a disaster for the company. We're talking about things that parts break, parts wear out, something happens, something goes wrong, which is beyond your control and which is often beyond the control of anybody. And the customer comes back, and the way that you deal with them at that particular point in contact defines their experience of your company, and it also defines the way that they're going to talk about your company in that overseas market when they go to their next, I don't know, Chamber of Commerce event or their next networking meeting. They're either going to say that the experience we had with the machine installation from the US was so smooth. Not everything went perfect, but they dealt with it so well, or it was just a complete nightmare. And that is going to define how you move forward, isn't it, in that particular market for the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. It's again, I feel like we're dissuading people from doing this because we're bringing up all the complications. But there certainly are, a lot of complications. There's a lot of complications, and they don't have to be prohibitive in the sense that they become too expensive, or that they result in some kind of local government action against your company or complete product failure or whatever. It doesn't have to go that far, right? And the best method for making sure that doesn't happen is planning, is thinking through these what if scenarios. What if there's a problem with our product? What if this component breaks? So thinking through those what if scenarios will take you time now and potentially some money in research, but it saves you time. And one thing I always encourage people is, infants crawl and then they walk and then they run, right? So maybe you get that fabulous order for 50,000 pieces. But if you've never shipped in that market before, and your first order is 50,000 pieces, and it gets to that country and there's customs has a problem with it, or it arrives and it doesn't meet regulatory requirements, or it doesn't match their electrical grid, or you need cleaner water than they have to operate it. I had a client selling solar panels. And so they sold solar panels, and they were supposed to work in very rough environments, so that if there was an earthquake or something, the solar panels could work. But what they found when they shipped them to a company that was kind of in a desert mountain area is that the water would clog up the device, which, how is that happening if it's supposed, because what they had tested it with for these earthquake type environments. They hadn't tested it for whatever was in the water in that country or in that landscape. And maybe it was a combination of some dust in the water and then the heat of the sun. I don't know. But if they had sold 50,000 of these units instead of shipping 10 to start with to be tested, they'd have a lot of product on the ground that would be very expensive to return or to ship somewhere else or to discount or to repair. So it's always a good idea to start with smaller quantities with one or two customers or one distributor, and then grow from there, because again, that's you want to go through your learning curve in manageable steps.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, like we've mentioned before, a lot of the kind of disaster scenarios that we've talked about, they can be avoided by doing the preparation up front, by making sure that you've trained people in country, be it your distribution partner, or that you've got an agreement with the company that you're selling to, that you can send in somebody to repair or install the equipment, to make sure that things are set up and to train their staff on it, to make sure there's processes in place or handbooks available with FAQs at the end of the day. It's not we're not talking about rocket science. We're talking about
It's
really
just
basic things.
all the boring stuff, right? But there are
Yeah,
people like us who actually like this.
I know.
So you just need
What
to
is
find somebody. I'm teaching a session this afternoon for a group. We're training women in manufacturing. We're doing like additional training programs, workforce development, which I'm super excited about. And my topic this afternoon is quality management systems. And I found this little clip, and it's a comedian. And I don't know why he gets on this rant, but he goes, can you imagine the guy who was at 5 years old, he woke up and said, I want to be in quality management. Susie's saying, when I grow up, I want to have a pony. And Bobby's saying, when I grow up, I want to be a fireman. And Tom is like, I want to be in quality management when I grow up. But these aren't things that you think people would aspire to do, but certainly certain personalities who like problem solving, and who like to analyze things and create, and recognize that you can create some procedure and some structure that will reduce the risk of having product failures or having unhappy customers or whatever it is. And those are the people that are best suited for creating these kinds of systems. So even if it's not you're the product development person, you've got this great product and idea, your sales, you know how to reach out to your customers and distributors. If you're not the right person to do this, you just need to find the one who is, right? And have them help you create these systems, because they're not complicated. They just take a certain way of looking at them, a certain perspective.
Yeah, that's very true. Is there anything else that we missed out from our topics that we should have covered today for what happens after the sale? Now what? The ultimate question. Now
I
what?
think just dawned on me, the only thing we haven't talked about is just a regular return policy. So
Yeah.
sometimes people return things and it's not warranty and it's not product failure or repair. It's just returns, right?
Mhm.
So, and again, that should be very, very fundamental to your business. But if you're shipping domestically and suddenly you start shipping internationally, you may not have thought about how that impacts the returns, what the cost of the return would be. Does it make more sense just to ship them a replacement
Mhm.
than have them return it to you and ship them a replacement? So that's something I would just add again. And then we've had some great comments from the audience.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you want to open that up, if they have anything else.
I don't know if does anybody have any other questions, because otherwise I just have a couple of final questions for Kim, if there's nothing else from the crew. I think everybody's been very quiet today, so a lot of information coming, kind of flowing in.
That's
So
because we're not quiet. So
yeah. So maybe just as a kind of final question, knowing what you do now, what advice would you give to a younger Kim who was starting out on the international journey that you would maybe do differently?
I think it's a very different place. I'm old, so when I was starting out, the globalization was just starting to grow, you know. So I was able to kind of ride the wave of that and professionally, and that allowed me, I took some risks, and those risks allowed me to be in a position where I could grow in, and have a lot of responsibility beyond my years or my experience. I think there are probably some places in the world that would still allow someone that kind of an opportunity, but they're not the same places as they were for me.
Mhm.
And so I think that that's very different. So it's important to understand when I talk to students, I often tell them, just to the point about the joke about being 5 years old and wanting to be a quality manager. Very few people want to go into chemicals, or very few people want to go into food. Like, you don't grow up saying, wow, I want to be in this industry most of the time. And you also don't grow up saying, wow, I really want to be a supervisor at a plant or something like that. So in terms of deciding what you're going to do, I think what's important is, how do you like to work your day? Are you like Kathryn and I, where you problem solve and you like to create these systems? Knowing that about yourself is really important to future professional happiness. And you can do something like that in the food industry or the equipment industry or the consumer products industry. And you can even do something like that in sales or in
Yeah.
manufacturing or in engineering. You can
Yeah,
use
I have a
those.
sales background, so that was,
And
yeah,
mine is operations. So you can use those skills in very different places. So I don't think it's so the industry that you go into and the job direction that you go into is, in my opinion, that's more about where are things growing and developing. So, and I'm not bragging here, but one of my children's a data scientist, and she's actually super creative, but that's a hot field. And so it gave her a way to finish college, go into the profession, really advance, quickly, be challenged, and still being a creative person when there's a lot of very data people in that space actually sets her out and allowed her to move up quickly. My one of my other kids is and I say this lovingly, a BS con artist personality. He could sell ice in Alaska. I mean, it's just how he is. And he went to engineering because having an engineering background and the technical ability with that personality, he loves motivating people and he loves building consensus and getting a team together. So having a technical ability and getting a team together, again, he's different from a lot of the other people that went
yeah,
to his program. So don't allow, if you think you have a sales personality, it doesn't mean you need to study sales.
no,
And if you love problem solving, doesn't mean you need to be an engineer. A salesperson with great problem solving skills, here's our good friend Kathryn, really really stands out, right? So I think you have to think, that's my advice, is to think about that. And then we have
a
question.
question from Catherine about whether companies are making too many assumptions around the universality of the English language.
Always, 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 always. I think what's difficult for companies in localizing language, either they have trust issues with hiring local people in that country, which can be true in, across from any culture A to culture B. That's not
Yeah.
restricted to any one country. So I think that's part of why they fear hiring local. And I think, as far as sending someone over to learn the language, as the older you get, there's a study many years ago that said that children are born with the ability to make every sound in every language in the world, because it's a physical ability, how you move your tongue, how you shape your mouth. By the time they're 2 or 3 years old, if they haven't used those sound mechanisms, they go away.
Mhm.
the wiring in the brain goes away. So the older you get and you try to learn a new language and wrap the physical mechanism of making that sound out of your mouth, the harder it's going to be. So I think people underestimate the challenge. Companies expect employees to be able to learn the language more quickly than they can. In some cultures, there's a bias that you're never going to be able to speak our language because there's almost a genetic component to it. If you weren't born here, how could you speak it?
Hmm.
And then there's cultures that are very high standard cultures. And so you could say 90% of the sentence correctly and 10% is wrong and the whole thing is wrong. And so that's a disincentive to attempt to speak the language. It is important not only because of the direct impact of how it influences your interaction with people in the country, builds trust, allows you to communicate directly without using a translator. Because the translator, even when they're doing their very best, their perspective is shaping how they're translating what they're saying. And in some cases, they're shifting it to protect you or protect the other person because they think what you've said is too confrontational and you shouldn't be confrontational or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, but it also, there are certain things you say in some languages that you don't in others. There
Yes.
are ways that you ask questions in one language that you wouldn't in another. And the cultural understanding that that gives you is as important as the ability to speak the language itself. So I do think it's super important, but I don't anticipate a vast improvement of companies prioritizing that. They're looking at skill set and ability and who are we moving from A to B and how does that fit within their growth model in the company. We want to give them this experience, so we're going to send them here, and so I think I don't anticipate that getting any better, even though it should. What would you say,
Unfortunately.
Kathryn?
Yeah, I think I'm not seeing a huge shift away from English because I'm seeing a lot of people who I'm seeing that companies who have people in their overseas subsidiaries are pushing their employees overseas to improve their English skills, rather than pushing employees in the head office to learn the local language of whichever country they're exporting to. I'm seeing that more. And I'm seeing ever less companies giving information out or doing localization projects. I'm seeing, at least on the product side. I know that on this kind of software side, then maybe this is different because if you're people do websites, but a lot of those projects are not really handed over properly as one compact localization project. They're often done on a piecemeal basis that okay, we're just starting in France, so we'll do a local company in France will organize the website in France, or a local company in
Or they'll
Colombia
translate
will do
it.
the
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if as you're speaking, it dawned on me. I wonder if globalization has, in some ways, made it worse. So 40 years ago, people might have thought, wow, if I move to Japan, I really have to learn to speak Japanese. Or if I move to Germany, I have to really learn to speak German from the US, I'm saying. And now, because of so much globalization and shared media, music and movies and the internet and all these things, if the assumption is, well, I'm communicating with people in Germany all the time and they speak English, so I don't need to learn it when I go there. So in some ways, globalization may have caused less diversity in language capability for people moving overseas or transacting business overseas, rather than created more reason for adapting to local languages, which is kind of strange.
Yeah, which is also a pity because that is part of the fun of going to a new place, is learning about the culture through the language, at least for me. But
Agreed.
yeah,
Agreed.
Catherine's got to run, so thanks, Catherine. It was nice to read you and hear. So yeah, uh, Kim, I think we are almost at the top of the hour. So maybe you can just finish up by telling us what kind of services that you offer, who should reach out to you um, and contact with you after this call, maybe.
Thank you. You think I'd be better at that, but I am. I would check me out on LinkedIn. Definitely connect me on LinkedIn. International trade is my area, especially the nitty-gritty of setting up operations, moving money, qualifying distributors and suppliers, like all of that sort of, nitty-gritty, deep um, content part of the international trade. And check out our international trade podcast too. Kathryn was one of our
Yes,
guests,
yes,
and it's called International Trade Resources.
yes. And so I think upon that particular point, I would say thank you to all of those people who've been watching over on LinkedIn and on YouTube. And thank you very much, Kim, for joining me for you this morning, for me on this gloriously sunny afternoon here in Austria.
Thanks, Kathryn. Thanks, everyone.